Welcome to English for Philosophy students, Lessons Online. Today we are doing lesson number 61 of Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. We're in rule number 7, and we're in the 14th lesson of that rule. Last time, we began a section that was entitled Christianity and Its Problems. But the first few pages talked about nothing but Christianity's accomplishments. All of this is what we call a concession that comes in the beginning before a main argument. Now we are going to look at some of the significant problems that Christianity failed to solve, supposedly. So let's begin to read. One moment. Hold on. Okay. Nietzsche described himself, with no serious overstatement, as philosophizing with a hammer. His devastating critique of Christianity, already weakened by its conflict with the very science to which it had given rise, involved two main lines of attack. Nietzsche claimed, first, that it was precisely the sense of truth developed in the highest sense by Christianity itself that ultimately came to question and then undermine the fundamental presuppositions of the faith. That was partly because the difference between moral or narrative truth and objective truth had not yet been fully comprehended, and so an opposition was presumed where none necessarily exists. But that does not belie the point. Even when the modern atheists opposed to Christianity belittle fundamentalists for insisting, for example, that the creation account in Genesis is objectively true, they are using their sense of truth, highly developed over the centuries of Christian culture, to engage in such argumentation. Carl Jung continued to develop Nietzsche's arguments decades later, pointing out that Europe awoke during the Enlightenment as if from a Christian dream, noticing that everything it had heretofore taken for granted could and should be questioned. God is dead, said Nietzsche. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, murderers of all murderers, console ourselves? That which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? Now, I found this paragraph rather hard to understand. It has some complex grammar. So let me help you do at least as well as I can do. Okay? So we will begin again. Nietzsche described himself with no serious overstatement. Again, we have our double negative. No overstatement. So that means he did not exaggerate when he said something about himself. So basically, this phrase, with no overstatement, means he spoke truly when he described himself as philosophizing with a hammer. So this means true. It was true when he described himself that he was a philosopher with a hammer. Now, when we think of a hammer, we think of a blunt object like a club. We do not think of a fine object like a scalpel or tweezers or needle. We think of a hammer, a mallet, a chisel. Nietzsche is claiming that his philosophy was like a rock that you destroy and crush and pulverize with, not a fine-tuned, laser-sharp instrument for dividing the threads of hairs. So Nietzsche begins by saying, I am a rough destroyer of everything. His devastating critique of Christianity. Now, when I was growing up, the word critique meant a neutral description. However, in recent years, the word has morphed into a negative. It means criticism. Actually, as I was growing up, the word criticism was neutral. You could have literary criticism speaking of how wonderful and great the work of literature was. It didn't have to be talking about the deficiencies, the bad things. It did not have to be negative. When I was growing up, criticism could be good or bad. It was merely descriptive. However, over the years, both criticism and critique have pretty much become negative. So critique now seems to mean to explore and demonstrate the negative qualities of something, the deficiencies. So Nietzsche's, his means Nietzsche, devastating critique of Christianity. So devastating is like the blunt hammer, drop a cinder block on it, crush and pulverize Christianity. So it suggests that Nietzsche destroyed Christianity with his criticisms. So Nietzsche's devastating critique of Christianity. Now here we have another phrase, already weakened by its conflict with the very science to which it had given rise. Okay, so this is a phrase which is set off in dash marks. It adds information. It is an insert. It adds information to the element it modifies. So Christianity was already weakened by its conflict with the very science to which it had given rise. Okay, to which is a grammatical particle that makes what comes after into the object. So, the idea is Christianity gave rise to science. Christianity gave birth to science. Christianity was part of the force which caused science to take off and thrive. But then science itself began to weaken Christianity. Science began to conflict with Christianity and thereby weaken Christianity. So Christianity provided the necessary conditions whereby science arose and flourished. But then science began to question Christianity itself, and the two became in conflict, and Christianity began to lose and be weakened. Okay, so all of this took place before Nietzsche came on the scene, because Christianity was already weakened by conflict with science before Nietzsche's devastating critique at the end of the 19th century. Okay, so at the end of the 19th century, Nietzsche began a devastating criticism of Christianity, and Christianity had already been weakened by conflict with science, the very science that Christianity made possible originally. He doesn't defend this, but I've seen many defenses of the fact that science flourished, it throve, it did very well in the West because of Christianity. The assumptions of Christianity are that there was a God who created the earth according to a plan which was orderly and consistent. And the creation makes rational sense, and man, in the image of God, is capable of understanding. Therefore, if you experiment and you repeat your experiment and you have findings and conclusions that are always the same, you can believe that they represent objective truth. So these presuppositions of Christianity made the scientific method possible, and then the scientific method gave birth to a thriving community of science, which then began to conflict with the dogma of Christianity, the belief of Christianity. So anyway, let us continue. So this phrase, already weakened by conflict with the very science to which it had given rise, you can take that out and read the sentence like this. Nietzsche's devastating critique of Christianity involved two main lines of attack. Okay, so the critique has two arguments, two lines of attack. We would expect him to go and list them, 1 and 2. However, he really only deals with the first of the two lines of attack in this paragraph. Okay, so as we expected, first, this will be the first line of attack against Christianity. Nietzsche claimed, a claim is unproven. It is his opinion. It is his assertion. This is not fact. This is Nietzsche's idea. That is why he uses the word claim and not a stronger word like revealed. Okay, Nietzsche claimed first that it was precisely the sense of truth developed in the highest sense by Christianity itself that ultimately came to question and then to undermine the fundamental presuppositions of the faith. Okay, let's try to find the skeleton of this sentence. Nietzsche claimed what? Nietzsche claimed that the sense of truth came into question and then came to question and then to undermine the presuppositions of the faith. In other words, our sense of truth got in the way of believing Christianity. Nietzsche claimed first that our concept of objective truth first questioned and then rejected the assumptions of Christianity. That is the skeleton of this sentence. Let's read it again. Nietzsche claimed first that it was precisely the sense of truth developed in the highest sense by Christianity itself. So again, he is saying Christianity had given rise to science. He's saying Christianity gave rise to a sense of truth. And that sense of truth, in the end, ultimately means in the end, came to, over time, began to question the faith and then undermine the faith, the fundamental presuppositions of the faith. Undermine means to dig the foundation out from under so the building collapses. So, our sense of truth caused us to destroy the edifice of Christianity by first questioning and then rejecting the fundamental presuppositions of Christianity. That was partly because the difference between moral or narrative truth and objective truth had not been fully comprehended. Okay, this is Jordan Peterson saying, we have to imagine what is meant by that, but I'll come back to it a moment later. That was partly because the difference between moral or narrative truth and objective truth had not been fully comprehended. And so an opposition was presumed where none necessarily exists, but that does not belie the point. Okay, first of all, moral or narrative truth is one thing. It's not moral truth or negative truth, it's narrative truth. It's moral or narrative, being one thing. Moral truth versus objective truth. Narrative truth versus objective truth. So what Jordan Peterson is saying is that the Bible may have a form of truth that the scientists are not looking for. The scientists are looking for objective truth, the type of truth you can demonstrate in a laboratory with repeated experiments. Scientists are materialists, and a materialist defines the universe as that which is material. So obviously, if there is truth that is supernatural, a scientist cannot expect to demonstrate it through the scientific method. However, the difference between moral or narrative truth and objective truth had not yet been fully comprehended. And so, an opposition was presumed where none necessarily exists. So Jordan Peterson is speculating or proposing or claiming, as Nietzsche claimed, that the reason science questioned and then rejected the fundamentals of Christianity, the reason was not that Christianity is false, but that its form of truth is not compatible, discernible, provable by scientific method, and that scientists didn't understand that. I personally am not sure of that. I think that there was some degree of desire on the part of the scientists to break free of the church, of the fear of hell that the church used to control people. And I think that the scientists were very happy to undermine and disprove the church so as to liberate themselves from moral obligation that comes from the church. This is my claim, my idea. Jordan Peterson here is suggesting that maybe they didn't understand the difference between moral and narrative truth and objective truth. It is true that historically, when the scientific community began in the early 20th century to claim to have disproved the Bible, they made positive claims that the Bible was wrong and false. Not just, we have no evidence that Jericho ever existed, but they would say, we have evidence Jericho did not exist. And therefore, the narrative story in the Bible of the fall of the wall of Jericho is false. When science began to make absolute claims to have disproven the Bible, the result in the church was to emphasize moral and narrative truth. In other words, the church conceded that science must be right, but that the Bible still had authority. It had moral authority. They basically developed a theology called neo-orthodoxy that basically said, it doesn't matter if the miracles ever occurred. The important thing is the miracle in our heart. It doesn't matter if Jesus did not rise, literally. What matters is he has risen in my heart. Now, in my opinion, it does matter whether the history is true. And in my opinion, science has not proven the history of the Bible false. But let's go back to this book. Jordan Peterson is suggesting that the difference between objective truth and moral truth was not yet fully understood. And that's why, partly why, the scientists rejected and undermined Christianity. So, back to the question of what does that refer to? It refers to the action of the scientists in undermining and destroying Christianity, the presuppositions of Christianity, due to their heightened awareness of truth. Okay, and Jordan says that that was caused in part, partly, by a failure to understand the difference between moral or narrative truth on one hand and objective truth on the other hand. And so, an opposition between two kinds of truth was presumed where none existed or necessarily exists. So what Jordan Peterson is saying here is the scientists assumed that if the details of the science in the Bible, like the existence of miracles or the idea that the earth was created 5,000 years ago as opposed to millions of years ago, if the Bible was wrong objectively on its science, then it needs to be thrown out entirely. There's an opposition. Either it's true or it's false. Jordan says, no, it could be false from a scientific point of view, but true from a moral point of view. So, anyway, that's what he's saying. He's saying that the opposition doesn't necessarily exist between the two kinds of truth, but Nietzsche presumed it did. And then he goes on to say, but that does not belie the point. And the point, I believe, is that Christianity gave rise to the environment which fostered a development of truth and scientific truth and belief in objective truth, belief in order in the material world and provable facts, etc., which then turned on religious dogma and disproved it, or attempted to disprove and topple the edifice. Okay, that's the point. And the fact that they don't understand that there's no opposition between moral and objective truth does not belie the point. That means give lie to or disprove or even undermine. So, Jordan is saying, maybe this is the reason, but it doesn't really matter because the historical event occurred that science rejected and destroyed, or sort of philosophically destroyed or tried to destroy Christianity. Okay, even when, let me get another color here. Even when the modern atheists opposed to Christianity belittle fundamentalists for insisting, for example, that the creation account in Genesis is objectively true. They are using their sense of truth, highly developed over the centuries of Christian culture, to engage in such argumentation. So this is a piece of support for the thesis that Christianity gave rise to science. Science developed an understanding of truth, which it used to destroy Christianity. That's the thesis. This is support. The support says, when atheists belittle fundamentalists, they are using their sense of truth to engage in the argumentation. So let me just underline for you the skeleton. Oh, darn. When modern atheists today belittle fundamentalists, they make fun of fundamentalists, they are using their sense of truth to engage in such argumentation. So this is clearly an example of a supporting example of the thesis. Even, and he uses the word even, meaning even today we can see it. We do not need to look too far away to find proof of our thesis that the early scientists used their sense of truth, etc. So even when modern, today, atheists who are currently opposed to Christianity, so right now they're doing the task of undermining and destroying Christianity, just like Nietzsche did, just like scientists did. Okay, even today when they do it, and how do they do it? For example, they make fun of the fundamentalists for believing that creation is true. 7 days of creation. You dummy, you believe that. You don't believe in evolution. Ha ha. Even when they're doing that, they are using their sense of objective truth. They are believing that what they know as evolution is objectively true. And that sense of truth was highly developed over centuries of Christian culture. There are other cultures that do not have an objective sense of truth, like the West. Presumably. Pretty sure there are. Anyway, they are using this sense of truth to engage in such argumentation. Carl Jung continued to develop Nietzsche's arguments decades later, pointing out that Europe awoke during the Enlightenment as if from a Christian dream, noticing that everything it had heretofore taken for granted could and should be questioned. Okay, so now we have Carl Jung. This is another point of support. So we'll go on to, we'll go to orange. Carl Jung developed Nietzsche's arguments, Nietzsche's devastating critique, decades later, pointing out, so Carl Jung revealed and noticed and wrote that Europe awoke during the Enlightenment as if from a Christian dream. So during the Middle Ages, the Christians just all believed in the Christian worldview as though they were asleep and not even awake to the realities of the world around them. That's what he's saying. And when they awoke, they noticed that everything they had heretofore taken for granted, meaning everything that before this time they believed, everything we believed in the past, could and should be questioned. So Carl Jung says that when Europe awoke from the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, it was as if they awoke from a dream of believing in Christianity and discovered that they should be questioning everything. God is dead, said Nietzsche. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, murderers of all murderers, console ourselves? That which was the holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet possessed, has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe the blood off of us? So the idea is that Nietzsche said that God was dead because he pointed out that science had disproven the presuppositions of Christianity. God remains dead. We can't believe in him anymore now that we know he is false. There is a joke that says faith is defined as believing something you know isn't true. That is a joke that atheists tell about Christians, that faith is defined as believing things you know aren't true. Nietzsche is saying that once you know there is no God, you can't believe in him anymore. And any benefit you may have gotten in terms of consolation. And remember the last paragraph or two where they talked about how Christianity was very good at comforting people with hope of heaven and hope of a loving God who was controlling your life for good. All of that gave people courage and hope. But if you have proven that that's a lie, there is nothing after death, there is no God, then how should we console ourselves? We are now as bad off as we were before Christianity came. Only even worse, because before Christianity, you had many gods that you could propitiate with sacrifices. And science can disprove those even more easily than Christianity. So Nietzsche says, God is dead. Science has proven that. God remains dead. He's not going to resurrect. And we have killed him. We, the philosophers and the scientists. How shall we, murderers of all murderers, console ourselves? That which was the holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet possessed. The holiest and mightiest of all the world has yet possessed. Jordan Peterson would agree with that. Christianity brought us to a new height, has bled to death under our knives. We questioned, we probed, we cut, we disproved, we undermined, and then the edifice toppled and God was crushed. Who will wipe this blood off of us? So, when you're in a world without God and you have a sense of guilt, what can you do with it? Let us read a bit further. We won't get very far, but I don't want to end too early. I'm just going to read, but I probably won't explain. Okay? The central dogmas of the Western faith were no longer credible, according to Nietzsche, given what the Western mind now considered truth. But it was his second attack on the removal of the true moral burden of Christianity during the development of the church that was most devastating. The hammer-wielding philosopher mounted an assault on an early established and then highly influential line of Christian thinking, that Christianity meant accepting the proposition that Christ's sacrifice, and only that sacrifice, had redeemed humanity. This did not mean absolutely that a Christian who believed that Christ died on the cross for the salvation of mankind was thereby freed from any and all personal and moral obligation. But it did strongly imply that the primary responsibility for redemption had already been borne by the Savior, and that nothing too important to do remained for all too fallen human individuals. So, I want to go back for a second. Okay, so remember this sentence, his devastating critique of Christianity involved two main lines of attack. First, the sense of truth developed by Christianity disproved Christianity. Second, hold on. Second, the removal of the true moral burden of Christianity during the development of the church. He attacked this. Remember, here we have a sense of guilt. That can't be controlled, assuaged, can't be consoled. This is a terrible problem for Nietzsche. The second attack is on the idea that Jesus took our sins on himself and got them forgiven in a way that does not require us to pay for the sin. In Christianity, we have an idea that Jesus took the punishment for our sins, and we don't have to bear guilt or punishment. We are free to move forward in the love of God and in moral perfectibility because the devastation of our former sins is wiped away and is no longer holding us back. Nietzsche attacked that idea. he attacked the idea that people are freed from any and all personal moral obligation. I think Nietzsche misunderstood Christianity. In the Bible, the Apostle Paul speaks of a line of thinking where people say, if Jesus takes away our sins, why should we not sin even more? Because we will be forgiven. We can sin as much as we want because we will be forgiven. And Paul says, may it never be. Why should you, who have been cleaned and made free of sin, go back in it? It seems to me that Nietzsche is falling into this wrong thinking when he says that the development of Christianity caused people to not develop morally and take responsibility for some moral development. We will have to discuss this next week, and there's much more to talk about here because this paragraph only introduces the concept and the next paragraphs support it. But the first attack of Nietzsche was that science has disproved Christianity, and the second attack is that Christianity became bad for people because it removed the motivation for moral achievement. Now, personally, I don't think that's true. I think that history shows that the greatest Christians achieved the most morally. But Nietzsche is postulating a logical train of thought that if people can be forgiven, they will just sin it up. They'll sin as much as they want. They won't try to be good. So next time, we'll see what Jordan Peterson has to say about all of this. See you then.